Every truth has its own time. Some people spend years searching for answers, only to discover that love was waiting for them all along. If stories like this stay with you long after the ending, subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps us continue creating cinematic stories that inspire hope, forgiveness, and second chances. Now let's begin. Some people believe the past stays buried. They're wrong. The past learns your address. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted through the community library long before the first guests arrived, mixing with the faint scent of old paper and polished wood that had become the heartbeat of my life. Every Thursday evening, volunteers transformed the reading hall into a neighborhood dinner to raise money for children's literacy programs. It wasn't glamorous. Folding tables replaced expensive banquet halls. Handwritten place cards replaced crystal centerpieces. But it mattered. At 28, I had learned that ordinary kindness often carried more weight than spectacular promises. I adjusted the faded blue apron around my waist and carefully set another stack of donated books onto the welcome table. The same pair of reading glasses rested in my cardigan pocket, and beside the cash box sat a weathered novel with a burned corner that I had been restoring page by page for almost 2 years. Most people saw damaged paper. I saw proof that broken things could survive. My friend Evelyn waved from the kitchen doorway, balancing 2 trays of roasted chicken. "Avery, the guest list doubled again. Think we have enough coffee?" I smiled despite the ache in my shoulders. "People forgive almost anything if the coffee keeps coming." She laughed and disappeared behind the swinging door while I straightened another chair. Outside, autumn painted the sidewalks gold beneath the streetlights. Families crossed the square carrying grocery bags. Teenagers laughed near the bus stop. Somewhere down the block, an old radio played a country song that reminded me of summers before everything fell apart. For a few quiet minutes, life felt almost ordinary. Then every conversation in the room stopped. I didn't understand why until I noticed everyone looking toward the entrance. A black sedan had pulled quietly to the curb. Not flashy, not surrounded by chaos, just deliberate. The driver's door opened first. 2 men stepped onto the sidewalk, scanning the street with practiced calm before another door opened. The last man climbed out slowly, buttoning the front of a charcoal coat as though he had nowhere else to be. Even before I saw his face, something inside me tightened. Memory has strange instincts. Sometimes your heart recognizes danger before your eyes do. He stepped beneath the library lights, and the world around me seemed to fade into silence. Nolan Mercer. 12 years had changed almost everything about him. The reckless teenager from my nightmares had become a man whose quiet confidence filled every inch of the room without demanding attention. His dark hair was touched by the first hint of maturity at the temples, and his gray eyes remained impossibly steady, revealing nothing. People whispered his name with fear across the city now. Newspapers called him the most powerful crime figure anyone had ever failed to photograph smiling. Children crossed the street when his motorcade passed. Business owners lowered their voices whenever someone mentioned Mercer. But none of those stories mattered to me. I remembered only the fire. I remembered standing barefoot across the street as flames swallowed my childhood home. I remembered neighbors pulling me back while I screamed for my parents. And I remembered seeing Nolan disappear into the smoke before anyone ever found answers. Every terrible year afterward had attached his name to my grief until I could no longer separate one from the other. His eyes found mine almost immediately. Not with surprise. Recognition. As if he had expected this moment for years. My fingers tightened around the coffee pot so hard the handle pressed into my palm. I wanted to look away. I couldn't. Without speaking, he walked across the room, ignored every empty table available, and stopped directly in front of mine. Slowly, he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. His voice, when it finally came, was calm enough to make my heart beat louder. "Hello, Avery." For a moment, neither of us moved. The room filled with the gentle clatter of dishes, quiet conversations, and children laughing near the reading corner, but all of it sounded impossibly far away. Nolan Mercer sat across from me with the patience of someone who had waited years for this exact moment. His charcoal coat rested neatly over the back of his chair, and his hands remained folded on the table. They were steady. Mine were not. I forced myself to pour his coffee before anyone noticed my trembling. The dark liquid rippled against the ceramic cup, betraying what I desperately tried to hide. He thanked me with a small nod. Not a smile. Not arrogance. Just quiet courtesy that somehow unsettled me even more. Monsters were supposed to look different. They were supposed to make hatred easy. He only looked tired. I placed the cream and sugar beside his cup without meeting his eyes. "Do not pretend you remember me," I said softly. "I never forgot you," he answered. His voice carried no anger, no defensiveness, only certainty. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. That must have been convenient. Across the room, Evelyn called my name, asking where she should place another tray of bread. I answered automatically without taking my eyes off the man sitting across from me. Years of surviving had taught me how to function even while my heart threatened to outrun my thoughts. Nolan glanced toward the shelves lining the library walls. Hundreds of donated books surrounded us, their worn spines carrying stories of hope, adventure, forgiveness, and second chances. "You built something beautiful here," he said. "You do not get to compliment my life after destroying it." My words landed harder than I intended. Several guests briefly looked our way before returning to their conversations. Nolan lowered his gaze to the table. "You believe that is what happened?" The sentence ignited something inside me. "Believe?" I whispered. "My father never came home. My mother disappeared 6 months later. Our house was gone. Your name was in every newspaper. Everyone knew." He looked back at me, and for the first time I saw something flicker behind those calm gray eyes. Regret. Not fear. Not shame. Something heavier. Newspapers rarely print the whole story. "Then tell me the whole story." Silence settled between us. It stretched long enough for me to realize he was not searching for words. He was deciding whether I was ready to hear them. Instead of answering, he reached inside his coat and carefully placed a small object onto the wooden table between us. My breath caught before I even touched it. It was an old silver pocket watch, its surface scratched with age, the chain carefully polished. A thin crack crossed the glass, but the initials engraved inside were unmistakable. JV. My father's initials. I stared at the watch as though it might disappear if I blinked. Firefighters had told me nothing survived the blaze. Insurance investigators repeated the same story. Every memory from that night insisted this watch had been lost forever. My fingers hovered above it without making contact. "Where did you find this?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. Nolan did not answer immediately. He watched me the way someone watches an old wound reopen. "Your father placed it in my hand the last time I saw him." My chair scraped softly against the floor as I stood. "That is impossible." "I wish it were." My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Every certainty I had carried for 12 years shifted ever so slightly beneath my feet. Across the room, the old library clock chimed 7 times. Outside, headlights swept across the front windows before disappearing down the quiet street. Nolan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. His eyes moved past me toward the entrance. Calm became alertness. He spoke so quietly only I could hear. "Avery, has anyone unfamiliar been asking about you lately?" I frowned, trying to understand why his question sounded less like curiosity and more like urgency.
No, iyan suarat.
Should there have been? Nolan did not respond right away. His attention drifted toward the tall windows facing the street, where passing headlights briefly painted silver lines across the wooden floor before disappearing into the night. The library remained warm and welcoming. Parents chatted over coffee. Children colored pictures in the reading corner. Volunteers carried fresh trays of homemade pie between tables. Nothing about the evening looked unusual, yet the quiet confidence that had surrounded Nolan since he arrived had shifted into careful calculation. He reached for his coffee but never took a sip. "You should leave early tonight," he said. I folded my arms. "You do not get to tell me what to do." A faint breath escaped him that almost sounded like disappointment. "You still answer exactly the way you did when you were 16. That caught me off guard. I searched his face for any sign of mockery and found none. "You remember that?" I asked before I could stop myself. "I remember more than you think." My pulse quickened. 12 years ago I had been nothing more than a frightened teenager standing outside a burning home while neighbors tried to comfort me. I had convinced myself that Nolan Mercer had disappeared because he had nothing left to fear. Yet the man sitting across from me carried memories with the weight of someone who had never escaped that night either. Evelyn approached our table carrying a basket of warm dinner rolls. "Everything all right over here?" she asked with a bright smile. Before I could answer, Nolan stood and politely accepted the basket from her, placing it gently in the center of the table. "Everything is fine," he said. His manner surprised her as much as they surprised me. She wished us a pleasant evening and walked away without another question. I stared after her. Everyone expects you to be terrifying. Most people see what they already decided to believe. His answer lingered between us longer than I wanted it to. I looked down at my father's pocket watch again. The scratched silver reflected the soft library lights, and for the first time I noticed something I had somehow missed. Tiny letters had been carved inside the back cover beneath my father's initials. They were almost invisible unless the light struck at exactly the right angle. I lifted the watch carefully. These were not here before. Nolan leaned forward just enough to see. Yes, they were. "It says Maple Harbor." My voice dropped into a whisper. Maple Harbor was a small fishing town, nearly 200 miles away. We had never lived there. My parents had never mentioned it. "What does it mean?" I asked. Nolan's eyes remained fixed on the engraving. "It is where your father wanted to take you after everything was over." Confusion rushed through me. After what was over? Once again silence. Not evasive silence. Painful silence. It looked as though every honest answer cost him something. Before he could speak, my phone vibrated inside my apron pocket. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I almost ignored it until another message appeared immediately afterward. It contained no greeting, no signature, only a single sentence. "Stop asking questions about the fire if you want your memories to stay your only loss." A cold sensation spread through my chest. I looked up instinctively. Nolan had not seen the message, but he noticed my expression change. "What happened?" he asked quietly. I turned the screen toward him. He read the words once, and every trace of warmth disappeared from his face. He did not look surprised. He looked like someone whose greatest fear had finally arrived. His eyes lifted to meet mine, steady but unmistakably troubled. "Avery," he said, "someone else knows that I came here tonight." I read the message again, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something harmless. They did not. The glow of my phone screen suddenly felt too bright against the soft library lights. Around us, children continued laughing over a stack of picture books while volunteers carried steaming bowls of soup between tables. The ordinary warmth of the evening clashed painfully with the knot tightening inside my chest. Nolan reached across the table without touching the phone. He did not need to. He had already memorized every word. "Do not reply," he said quietly. "I was not planning to." "Good." His answer came too quickly. It sounded practiced, like advice he had given before. I slipped the phone back into my apron pocket, but I could still feel it vibrating against my side even though no new message arrived. Who would send something like that? I asked. Nolan looked toward the front entrance again before lowering his voice. "Someone who believed the past would remain buried. You keep speaking in riddles. Because the truth is dangerous before it is complete." I almost laughed from frustration. "You have had 12 years to explain yourself." His jaw tightened. "And I have spent 12 years trying to keep certain people from finding you." The sentence settled heavily between us. I searched his face for any sign that he was manipulating me, yet the man sitting across from me did not look victorious. He looked exhausted, as though every answer carried another burden he wished I would never have to carry. Evelyn returned carrying a clipboard filled with donation forms. "Avery, can you help the Johnson family at the registration table?" she asked. I nodded automatically, grateful for an excuse to step away. As I crossed the room, I forced myself to smile at guests, handed out raffle tickets, thanked neighbors for their donations, and helped an elderly couple carry a box of children's books to the display shelf. My body continued moving through familiar routines while my thoughts remained trapped at the small wooden table behind me. Several minutes later, I glanced across the room. Nolan had not moved. He was not looking at me anymore. Instead, his attention rested on the front windows overlooking the quiet street. Outside, a delivery van rolled slowly past before continuing toward the next intersection. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet Nolan followed it until it disappeared from sight. When I returned, I noticed something new resting beside my father's pocket watch. It was a faded photograph no larger than my palm. Time had softened its edges, but the image remained clear enough to steal my breath. A younger version of my father stood beside another man on a wooden dock overlooking the ocean. Between them stood a little girl wearing an oversized knit sweater and holding a bright red kite. Me. I remembered that sweater. My grandmother had knitted it during one unusually cold spring, but I had no memory of the photograph itself. I slowly picked it up. Who took this? Nolan's eyes remained on the picture. Your mother. My heart skipped. You knew my mother? Yes. I stared at him in disbelief. Then why did you never come back? For the first time since he arrived, Nolan looked directly into my eyes without hesitation. Because your mother made me promise that if anything happened, I would disappear until the people responsible believed you were forgotten. Before I could ask another question, the old bell above the library door chimed softly. A man wearing a dark baseball cap stepped inside, removed his gloves and slowly surveyed the room. He did not approach the registration desk. He did not greet anyone. His eyes paused only briefly before settling in our direction. Nolan noticed him at the exact same moment I did. Without changing his calm expression, he quietly slid the photograph into my hand and whispered, "Do not let anyone else see that picture." I slipped the photograph inside the restored novel lying beside the cash box before anyone could notice. The burned corner of the old book hid it perfectly, as though the story itself had decided to protect another secret. When I looked back toward the entrance, the man in the baseball cap was still standing near the door. He smiled politely when an elderly volunteer greeted him, accepted a program from the welcome table, and wandered slowly through the library like any ordinary visitor. Yet something about the way he observed the room unsettled me. He never paused to browse the books. He never looked at the donation displays. His attention drifted from face to face with quiet precision, lingering only a heartbeat too long before moving again. Nolan remained seated, calm enough that anyone watching would assume he was simply enjoying an evening meal. Only his eyes betrayed him. They tracked every movement without appearing to. I returned to the registration table, forcing myself to help guests sign raffle cards and answer questions about next month's reading program. My smile felt borrowed. Every few seconds I caught myself glancing toward the entrance again. The stranger had moved deeper into the building. He stopped in front of the local history shelf and pretended to examine a book while occasionally lifting his gaze toward our table. My stomach tightened. When the dinner finally slowed, I carried a fresh pot of coffee back to Nolan. "He is still here," I whispered. Nolan nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Do you know him?" "No. But I know the type." I poured coffee into his cup with careful hands. "You speak as though someone has been watching me for years." He looked at the rising steam before answering. "Not years. Months." The words landed harder than I expected. "Months. Did you ever notice the same car parked near your bookstore?" I searched my memory. There had been a gray sedan across the street several mornings, but I had assumed it belonged to someone working nearby. There had also been unfamiliar customers who bought nothing, spending more time looking around than reading. Small moments I had dismissed because life taught ordinary people not to imagine extraordinary dangers. I thought I was imagining things, I admitted. Nolan finally picked up his coffee, though he still did not drink it. "You were paying attention." My thoughts raced through the past few months. A package delivered to the wrong address. Strange silence whenever I answered unknown phone calls. Footsteps outside my apartment one rainy evening that disappeared before I reached the window. None of it had seemed connected until now. Why would anyone care about me? I asked. Nolan's expression softened with unmistakable sadness. "Because you are your father's daughter." Before I could respond, a cheerful voice interrupted us. "Excuse me." We both looked up. The man in the baseball cap stood beside the table holding a donated mystery novel. Up close he appeared to be in his late 40s, with kind eyes and neatly trimmed gray hair visible beneath the cap. Nothing about him looked threatening. He smiled warmly at me. I heard you own Whitmore Books on Oak Street. My heartbeat quickened. Yes. Wonderful little shop. My granddaughter loves it there. His voice remained pleasant as he placed a folded $20 bill into the donation jar. Communities need places like this. I thanked him automatically. He nodded once, then turned toward Nolan. Their eyes met for less than a second. The stranger's smile never faded, but something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Not friendship. Not surprise. Recognition. Without another word, the man walked calmly toward the exit, opened the front door, and disappeared into the cool autumn evening. I waited until the door closed before looking back at Nolan. He had gone completely still. Who was he? I asked. Nolan stared through the glass long after the man had vanished. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had heard all night. Someone who was supposed to believe your family disappeared forever. The library slowly emptied as the evening drew to a close. Families gathered sleepy children, volunteers stacked folding chairs, and the comforting aroma of coffee gave way to the faint scent of extinguished candles. Normally I love this part of the night. It always reminded me that small communities survived because ordinary people quietly chose to care about one another. Tonight, every familiar sound carried an uneasy edge. I watched the front door long after the stranger disappeared, half expecting him to walk back inside as though he had forgotten something. He never did. Nolan remained where he was, patiently waiting while I helped Evelyn count donations and lock display cases. He never interrupted me. He never rushed me. Every few minutes our eyes met across the room, and each time I found the same calm expression waiting for me. It frustrated me more than anger would have. When the last guest finally stepped outside, Evelyn grabbed her coat and smiled. You two can lock up, right? I promised my sister I would help with her twins tonight. I forced a cheerful smile. We have it covered. She thanked us, wished us good night, and disappeared into the crisp autumn air. The front door closed softly behind her. Silence settled over the library. The building suddenly felt much larger without the voices that had filled it all evening. I walked to the entrance and turned the lock. As I did, I caught my reflection in the dark glass. Behind me, Nolan was carefully collecting the empty coffee cups from our table. It was such an ordinary gesture that I almost forgot who he was supposed to be. You do not have to do that, I said. He placed another cup onto the serving tray. Someone has to help. I stared at him. You make it difficult to hate you. He paused for only a second before answering. That was never my goal. Together we carried dishes into the small kitchen. The old dishwasher hummed while I rinsed ceramic mugs beneath warm water. Nolan rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt without hesitation and quietly dried each plate before placing it back into the cabinet. The strange normalcy of standing beside him unsettled me almost as much as everything else that had happened tonight. Finally I broke the silence. Tell me one truth. Just one. He continued drying a plate. Ask. I took a slow breath. Did my father trust you? Nolan stopped moving. Carefully, he set the plate onto the counter before meeting my eyes. Yes. Completely. Enough to place your future in my hands. My thoughts refused to accept the answer. The father I remembered had warned me never to trust people who chased power. Yet somehow he had trusted the man the entire city feared. Then why did everyone say you destroyed us? Nolan rested both hands against the wooden countertop, his voice barely above a whisper. Because someone needed the city to believe that story. Before I could ask who, a soft mechanical click echoed through the quiet building. We both turned toward the reading hall. At first I thought it came from the old heating system. Then I heard it again. A tiny metallic sound from somewhere near the donation table. Nolan crossed the room with measured steps and picked up the small brass donation box. Beneath it rested a plain white envelope that had not been there before. No stamp. No address. Only my name written across the front in careful handwriting. Avery. My heartbeat quickened. I had walked past that table less than 5 minutes earlier. The envelope had not been there. Nolan handed it to me without opening it. This is your choice, he said quietly. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the single sheet inside. There was only one sentence typed across the center of the page. If you want the truth about Maple Harbor, come alone tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Then, taped to the bottom of the letter was a faded photograph of a woman standing beside the ocean. I stopped breathing. It was my mother. Older than I remembered. Alive. I stared at the photograph until the edges blurred beneath my trembling fingers. My mother stood on a wooden pier overlooking a calm stretch of ocean, the wind lifting strands of her auburn hair exactly the way I remembered from childhood. She looked older, of course. There were faint lines around her eyes that had not existed in my memories, but her smile remained unmistakable. The date printed in the lower corner stole what little breath I had left. 3 months ago. Not 12 years ago. Not before she vanished. 3 months. This cannot be real, I whispered. Nolan accepted the photograph carefully, studying every detail before handing it back. His expression did not carry surprise. It carried confirmation. It is recent, he said quietly. Then you knew. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment. I hoped. My voice rose despite myself. You hoped? Nolan, I buried my mother in my heart 12 years ago. The words echoed through the empty library before fading into silence. He never interrupted my anger. He simply waited until I finished breathing hard enough to hear him again. I never saw her after the night she disappeared, he said. But I believe she stayed alive because that was the only way your father's sacrifice made sense. I looked at the photograph again. Every answer seemed to create 3 more questions. If she had survived, why had she never contacted me? Why let me spend more than a decade believing I had lost everyone? I unfolded the letter once more, reading every word until I could recite it from memory. Maple Harbor. 9 o'clock. Come alone. I am going, I said. Nolan shook his head immediately. Not alone. The letter says otherwise. The letter was written by someone who wants you isolated. I folded my arms. You expect me to ignore the first proof that my mother might still be alive? He met my eyes without hesitation. No. I expect you to stay alive long enough to learn the truth. The room fell quiet again. Outside, wind scattered dry leaves across the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the night, low and lonely, reminding me that the world continued moving no matter how completely my own had changed in a single evening. I carefully slid the photograph back into the restored novel beside my father's pocket watch. 2 pieces of my past now rested inside a book I had spent years repairing without realizing it would someday become the safest place for my family's history. Nolan noticed the gesture. You always protect damaged things, he said softly. I almost smiled before remembering who I was speaking to. Books cannot lie. Neither can photographs. I looked toward the dark windows. Then someone has been hiding the truth instead. Nolan nodded once. Yes. We finished cleaning the library in thoughtful silence before stepping outside together. The cool autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. The town square looked peaceful beneath rows of glowing street lamps. Nolan's sedan waited quietly across the street. My little hatchback remained parked beneath the oldest maple tree near the corner. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Too ordinary. As I unlocked my car door, something white caught my attention beneath the windshield wiper. Another envelope, smaller than the first. My name was written across it in the same careful handwriting. Nolan saw it at the same moment I did. His expression hardened. I slowly opened the folded note. This time there were only 6 words. Do not trust Nolan Mercer anymore. Before I could react, something slipped from the envelope and landed softly against the pavement. It was another old photograph. I picked it up with shaking hands. This one showed my father standing beside Nolan many years ago, both smiling for the camera. Across the bottom, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were words that made my entire world tilt once again. If anything happens to me, trust Nolan before anyone else. I could not take my eyes off my father's handwriting. I traced each letter with the tip of my finger, half expecting the ink to vanish like every other certainty I had carried for the past 12 years. Trust Nolan before anyone else. My father had never wasted words. Every birthday card, every note tucked into my school lunch, every blueprint he sketched had been precise and deliberate. If he had written those words, he had meant them. I folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket without saying anything. Nolan remained several feet away beside his car, giving me the space to think. He never asked what the note said. Somehow that silence earned more of my trust than any explanation could have. Finally I looked up. "Did you know my father wrote this?" I asked. He studied my face before answering. "No. You are telling the truth." "Yes." I nodded slowly. "I believe you." The words surprised both of us. For the first time all evening, something softened behind Nolan's guarded expression. Not relief exactly. Gratitude. Quiet and restrained. We stood beneath the maple tree while cold wind scattered dry leaves across the empty parking lot. The town had fallen asleep around us. Storefront lights clicked off one by one, leaving only the warm glow from distant street lamps. I unlocked my car but did not reach for the handle. "Tell me about Maple Harbor," I said. Nolan looked toward the dark horizon. "It is a fishing town where your father once worked before you were born. He believed nobody would ever think to look for him there, because everyone assumed he had cut ties with that part of his life. Why would he need to hide?" Nolan drew a slow breath. "Because he discovered something powerful people wanted buried forever." My heart quickened again. "What?" He shook his head. "That answer belongs to your mother." Frustration threatened to return, but this time I understood something different. Nolan was no longer avoiding the truth to protect himself. He was protecting pieces of a story that clearly belonged to someone else. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This message was different. Nusrets. Only a location pin dropped directly onto a map of Maple Harbor, followed by 3 words. "Bring the watch." I immediately showed Nolan. He looked at the screen for several seconds before quietly saying, "Whoever sent that knows exactly which evidence survived." "Then tomorrow is not a trap?" "It could be both." Slip the phone into my pocket. "I am still going." Nolan nodded once. "Then I am coming." The letter said alone. "Your father asked you to trust me." I looked toward the folded photograph resting safely inside my coat. He was right. For the first time since this impossible night began, I allowed myself to imagine that every story I had believed since childhood might have been carefully arranged by someone I had never questioned. We drove away separately, agreeing to meet before sunrise. My apartment felt unusually quiet when I finally stepped inside. I locked every door, placed the pocket watch, both photographs, and the mysterious letter across my small kitchen table, then opened the restored novel beside them. As I slid the first photograph back between its repaired pages, something stiff shifted beneath the binding. I frowned. The book had always felt slightly heavier than it should. Carefully, I separated 2 restored pages I had glued together months earlier without realizing anything had been hidden inside. A tiny brass key no longer than 2 inches slipped into my hand. Wrapped around it was a faded paper tag written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. Library locker number 12. Only Avery. Sleep never came. I lay awake watching the shadows from passing cars drift across my apartment ceiling while the tiny brass key rested on my nightstand beside my father's pocket watch. Every hour the old radiator clicked softly inside the wall, and every sound reminded me that by sunrise I would either discover the truth or lose the last pieces of the life I thought I understood. Before dawn I slipped the key, the watch, the photographs, and the restored novel into a canvas messenger bag. The streets were almost empty when I drove back toward the community library. Morning fog hovered above the sidewalks, wrapping the town in pale gray silence. Nolan was already waiting outside beside his sedan, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me without speaking. It was exactly how I always ordered it. "How did you know?" I asked. He looked almost embarrassed. "Your father used to bring you hot chocolate from the same cafe every Saturday. When you turned 16, you switched to coffee with 1 cream and 1 spoon of sugar because you said grown-ups were supposed to drink coffee." I stared at him. He remembered details even I had nearly forgotten. We unlocked the library together before sunrise. The building felt different without children laughing or volunteers arranging tables. Only the quiet smell of paper and polished wood greeted us. I walked directly toward the old row of wooden lockers that had not been used in years. Most visitors never noticed them because they blended into the wall beside the local history section. Brass numbers lined each small door. 12 waited near the bottom. My hands trembled as I slid the tiny key into the lock. Fit perfectly. For one long second I could not bring myself to turn it. Nolan stood several feet away, deliberately giving me space. The lock clicked. I slowly opened the narrow door. Inside rested a plain brown envelope sealed with dark blue wax, and a small cassette recorder covered in dust. Nothing else. The envelope carried my father's handwriting across the front. For Avery. Only when the time is right. Tears blurred my vision before I even touched it. I broke the brittle seal and unfolded several handwritten pages. The first line stole every ounce of air from my lungs. If you are reading this, then Nolan kept his promise longer than I ever deserved. I looked up at him in disbelief. He had not moved. He was staring at the floor as though he already knew what the letter contained but respected my father's final words enough never to read them himself. I continued reading. Your mother and I trusted very few people. Nolan was one of them. Everything the newspapers reported after the fire was carefully arranged to protect something far more dangerous than our family name. If you have reached this letter, then someone has begun searching again. Do not hate the man who carried our burden. Hate the lie that forced him to carry it. My hand shook so violently the pages rustled through the silent library. Then I noticed a folded map tucked behind the final page. A red circle marked one place along the Maple Harbor shoreline. Beside it my father had written 6 simple words. This is where your mother waited. I read my father's letter again before carefully folding it back into the envelope. Every sentence chipped away at the story I had carried since I was 16. Nolan had not asked to defend himself. He had simply endured years of blame because my parents believed that silence would keep me alive. I looked toward him. He was still standing a respectful distance away, his hands resting in the pockets of his coat, allowing me to absorb the truth without interruption. You never read this? I asked quietly. He shook his head. Your father told me that if I ever opened that envelope, I would be breaking the last promise I made to him. I lowered my eyes to the cassette recorder resting inside the locker. It was old enough to belong in a museum, its clear plastic window revealing a tape labeled only with today's date from 12 years ago. A folded note rested beneath it. Play this only after reading the letter. I carefully pressed the power button. The machine whirred softly before a familiar voice filled the silent library. My father's voice. Older than the memories inside my mind, but unmistakably his. Avery, if you can hear me, then life gave us one more miracle than I ever expected. My knees nearly gave way. I sat on the wooden floor without realizing I had moved. Tears blurred every shelf around me. You probably have more questions than answers. My father continued with a gentle laugh I had almost forgotten. That means Nolan did exactly what I asked. He protected your future instead of defending his own name. I looked toward Nolan again. He quietly turned away, giving me privacy even now. My father's voice continued. If you have begun searching for your mother, then you already know she survived. She could never return because too many people believed she carried something they desperately wanted. They were wrong. I carried it. I stopped breathing. Inside the blue lighthouse at Maple Harbor is a safety deposit box rented under another name. The key is not made of brass. The brass key only leads you here. The real key is hidden inside my pocket watch. My hands immediately reached for the silver watch lying beside the recorder. I turned it over slowly, remembering every scratch on its surface. Nolan quietly walked closer. May I? He asked. For the first time, I handed him something that had belonged to my father without hesitation. He examined the watch carefully before pressing a tiny notch hidden beneath the winding stem. A nearly invisible compartment opened inside the case. Resting there was an even smaller silver key wrapped in wax cloth. I stared in disbelief. My father had hidden it in plain sight all along. Nolan carefully returned the watch to me exactly as he had received it. I never knew it was there, he admitted. Before I could answer, my father's recorded voice spoke again. If Nolan is standing beside you while you hear this, then forgive him before you forgive me. I asked him to carry a burden that should have been mine. The recording clicked to silence. Neither of us spoke for several long moments. The quiet library suddenly felt sacred, as though every shelf had witnessed a promise surviving 12 impossible years. Finally I unfolded the map again. The red circle around Maple Harbor no longer looked like a mystery. It looked like the beginning of the truth. Nolan looked toward the front windows where morning sunlight had begun to spill across the floor. "We should leave soon," he said softly. I nodded. Then my phone vibrated once more. This time the message contained only a single photograph. It showed the blue lighthouse overlooking Maple Harbor. Standing outside its weathered door was the same woman from the earlier photograph. My mother. And she was looking directly into the camera as though she knew I was finally coming home. We left the library just after sunrise. The envelope, the cassette recorder, the map, and both keys rested safely inside my messenger bag. Yet they felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. The drive toward Maple Harbor stretched for nearly 3 hours, winding through quiet highways lined with golden trees and sleepy roadside diners just beginning to open for breakfast. Nolan drove behind me the entire way, never crowding my car, never disappearing from the rearview mirror. Somehow that steady distance comforted me, more than words could have. Around noon the ocean finally appeared beyond the hills, sparkling beneath a pale autumn sky. Maple Harbor looked exactly like the photographs in old travel brochures my father used to collect. Weathered fishing boats rocked gently against wooden docks. White clapboard houses overlooked narrow streets lined with flower boxes and small family cafes. It was peaceful enough to make the past feel impossible. We parked near the old lighthouse standing at the far end of the harbor. The blue paint had faded after years of salt air, but the tower remained proud against the shoreline. Before I stepped out of the car, Nolan quietly spoke. "Before we go inside, there is something I have to tell you." I closed the car door and faced him. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and pine between us. He looked toward the lighthouse instead of directly at me. "The night of the fire, your father called me because he knew someone had discovered what he was protecting. When I arrived, he was already preparing your mother to leave with you." My heart tightened. "But she did not take me." Nolan slowly shook his head. "She wanted to. Your father refused." I frowned. "Why?" "Because he believed they expected all 3 of you to disappear together. If you remained behind, people would believe the family had been destroyed. It was the only chance he believed would keep you hidden." I struggled to accept the terrible logic. "So they sacrificed 12 years with me." Nolan nodded, his own voice growing quieter. "Every decision they made was measured against one question. Would Avery survive?" Tears stung my eyes again, but this time they carried something new. Not only grief, understanding. We walked together toward the lighthouse entrance. The weathered wooden steps creaked beneath our feet, and gulls circled lazily overhead. Inside, the air smelled of old rope, salt water, and aging timber. A small office occupied the ground floor, now serving as a local maritime museum. An elderly caretaker looked up from his newspaper and smiled warmly. "Beautiful day to visit," he said. His gaze settled on the silver pocket watch in my hand before drifting toward Nolan. The smile faded almost imperceptibly. "You finally came," he said softly. My pulse quickened. "You know us." The caretaker folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "I knew your father." He reached beneath the counter and placed a small wooden box in front of me. "He asked me to keep this until a young woman carrying that watch walked through my door." My hands trembled as I accepted the box. There was no lock, only a folded note resting on top. I unfolded it carefully. My father's handwriting filled the page with one simple instruction. "Before you open what is inside, look out the eastern window." I turned toward the narrow window overlooking the harbor. Far below, standing alone at the end of the longest pier, a woman in a light gray sweater slowly raised her hand. Even from that distance, I recognized the way she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. It was the same small gesture she used every night when she kissed me goodnight. My mother had been waiting where my father promised she would be. I did not remember running down the lighthouse stairs. One moment I was staring through the narrow eastern window, and the next the cool ocean air filled my lungs as I crossed the weathered pier. Every footstep echoed across the wooden planks while the woman at the end remained perfectly still. She did not wave again. She simply waited. As I drew closer, the years between us seemed to collapse one memory at a time. The way she stood with one shoulder slightly lower than the other. The gentle smile she always wore when trying not to cry. Even the silver necklace resting against her sweater was the same one she wore in every photograph from my childhood. When only a few feet separated us, neither of us spoke. Words suddenly felt too small for 12 years of silence. She reached out first, touching my cheek with trembling fingers as though afraid I might disappear if she held on too tightly. "Avery," she whispered. Hearing my name in her voice broke something inside me. I wrapped my arms around her, and for the first time since I was 16, I no longer felt like an orphan carrying questions no one could answer. We stood there beside the ocean while gulls drifted overhead and gentle waves rolled against the dock below. When we finally stepped apart, tears glistened in both our eyes. "I am so sorry," she said quietly. "There has never been a day that I did not want to come back." I wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but only one escaped. "Why?" She looked toward the lighthouse where Nolan remained standing several yards away, deliberately keeping his distance. "Because your father believed the only way to keep you alive was to let the world believe we were gone." She gently took my hands in hers. He uncovered financial records connecting powerful people across several cities. They would have destroyed anyone who knew the truth. Your father copied everything and hid the evidence before they could find it. I glanced toward Nolan again. "And he carried the blame." She nodded slowly. "He wanted to tell you many times. I stopped him every single time. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every year. I could not risk losing you after already losing your father." My heart ached as I realized the burden they had all carried in different ways. Nolan had sacrificed his reputation. My mother had sacrificed her life with her daughter. My father had sacrificed everything else. She reached into the pocket of her sweater and handed me a folded newspaper clipping. It showed a recent article announcing that Nolan Mercer had quietly funded libraries, scholarships, and community centers throughout the city under anonymous charitable trusts. "Your father asked him to build something better while protecting you," she said. "He honored that promise every year." I slowly looked toward Nolan. He stood where he had always stood throughout this journey, never demanding forgiveness, never asking for recognition, simply waiting for me to reach the truth on my own. I walked back toward him while the ocean breeze carried away the last pieces of anger I had held for so many years. When I stopped in front of him, neither of us spoke immediately. I reached into my messenger bag, removed my father's pocket watch, and placed it gently into his hand. "You protected this for 12 years, I said softly. He looked down at the watch before closing. My fingers around it again. "No," he answered. "I protected it until it could finally return to its rightful owner." For the first time since that terrible night so many years ago, I understood the difference between the man I had spent years fearing and the man who had quietly guarded my family's final promise. Behind us, my mother smiled through tears as the afternoon sun illuminated the blue lighthouse, and for the first time in 12 years, the past no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the beginning of coming home. The following spring, I unlocked Whitmore books before sunrise just as I had every weekday for years, but nothing about my life felt the same anymore. Fresh paint brightened the old storefront, children's drawings covered one corner of the front window, and a small wooden sign announced that every Saturday afternoon the shop would host free reading circles for local families. It had been Nolan's idea, though he insisted nobody ever know it. Across the street, the community library had expanded its literacy program with new shelves, restored reading rooms, and scholarships created in my father's name. The anonymous donations that once puzzled everyone no longer felt mysterious. They felt like promises quietly fulfilled. My mother had returned to town slowly, choosing a simple life instead of hiding behind another identity. She volunteered at the library twice a week, laughing with children who never realized how extraordinary her ordinary smile truly was. We could never recover the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary mornings we had lost, but we learned something more valuable than reclaiming time. We learned how to build new memories without letting old grief decide who we became. The evidence my father protected eventually reached the people capable of preserving the truth. His name was finally remembered for his integrity instead of whispered through unfinished rumors. The burden Nolan had carried for 12 long years no longer belonged to him alone. Yet when newspapers tried to tell his story, he quietly declined every interview. Recognition had never been what he wanted. Peace was. One evening after closing the bookstore, I found him. Standing outside beneath the old maple tree where autumn leaves had first begun changing on the night everything shifted. He held a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "I think this belongs here now," he said. Inside rested my father's silver pocket watch, fully restored but unchanged where it mattered most. Every scratch remained. Every memory remained. Only the hands moved again, keeping perfect time after years of silence. I smiled as I slipped it into my pocket. "You fixed it." He looked toward the bookstore window where children had taped colorful paper stars across the glass. "It was never broken," he answered quietly. "It only needed someone willing to keep winding it." We stood together without speaking while the evening lights flickered on across the quiet street. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic promises, only the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to hide behind misunderstandings. I thought about the restored novel still resting on the front shelf inside my bookstore. Once, I had believed its burned pages represented everything I had lost. Now I understood why I could never throw it away. Fire had scarred its edges, but it had never destroyed the story waiting inside. Perhaps people were not so different. We all carried marks left by moments we never chose, yet those marks did not have to become our ending. As Nolan reached for the bookstore door and held it open for me, I realized the greatest lie I had ever believed was not that one man had destroyed my family. It was believing that love could not survive the weight of truth. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who fight the hardest battles. They are the ones who quietly protect hope until someone else is finally ready to believe it again. Some stories entertain us. Others quietly remind us that forgiveness is stronger than hatred, and truth is stronger than fear. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone you care about. Thank you for spending this journey with us. Until next time, may kindness always guide your path.